March 19, 1945, 12 miles off the coast of Kyushu, Japan. The air itself was a physical, shuddering thing. For the men aboard the Essex-class aircraft carrier USS Franklin, the world had narrowed to a cacophony of roaring aircraft engines, the deafening bark of 5-inch guns, and the frantic tinny commands crackling over the ship's intercom. The sea, a deep, unforgiving blue, churned with the wakes of dozens of warships. They were closer to the Japanese mainland than any carrier task force had dared to go, launching airstrikes to cripple the enemy's last defenses. And the enemy was answering. High above this organized chaos, a single speck detached itself from the bright white canvas of the clouds. It was a Mitsubishi Zero, its sleek, deadly form angled into a near-vertical dive. On the Franklin's bridge, a young lookout named Seaman James O'Brien felt his blood turn to ice. He didn't just see the plane, he saw the fanatical resolve of the pilot, a dark shape behind the canopy, committing himself and his aircraft to a single fiery purpose. "Kamikaze, starboard bow, coming straight in." His voice was a raw, high-pitched scream lost in the greater din. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries, a constellation of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons, swiveled as one. Tracers, glowing red and orange, reached up in a desperate, converging web. They stitched across the Zero's wings and fuselage, tearing pieces of metal away. But it didn't waver. It didn't pull up. This was not an attack. It was a delivery. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Jerica, the ship's intelligence officer, stood frozen for a fraction of a second, watching the inevitable. He could see the details now. The red Hinomaru on the wings, the fixed landing gear, the certain terrible trajectory. The Zero plunged through the hail of steel, a vengeful spirit ignoring its own mortal wounds. It slammed into the Franklin's flight deck, just aft of the island superstructure. The impact was a massive, hollow crump that vibrated through the soles of every sailor's feet. But the impact was only the door opening. The true hell followed. The Zero had been armed with two 250-kilogram bombs. They penetrated the wooden flight deck, plunging into the hangar bay below. And in that hangar bay, the Franklin was at her most vulnerable. Fully armed and fueled aircraft, Helldiver dive bombers and Avenger torpedo planes were lined up, being rearmed and refueled for the next strike. The bombs detonated in the heart of this volatile nest. The world turned white, then orange, then black. A fireball of unimaginable force erupted from the carrier's side, rolling upwards in a mushroom of smoke and debris. The concussion wave threw men across decks, shattered glass on the bridge, and was felt on ships thousands of yards away. Secondary explosions began immediately. 500-pound bombs, tiny Tim rockets, and thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel cooked off in a chain reaction of apocalyptic fury. The Franklin CV-13, a city of 3,000 men, had just been gutted. Flames leapt hundreds of feet into the air, and a thick, oily black smoke blotted out the sun. To any observer, Japanese or American, this was not a wound. This was a death sentence. No ship could survive this. Aboard the Franklin, time fractured. The single catastrophic explosion gave way to a continuous roaring inferno. The hangar deck became a kiln, melting steel and flesh alike. The flight deck, once a pristine runway, was a twisted, jagged ruin, peeled back like the lid of a tin can. Amidst the chaos, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of human resolve. The ship's commanding officer, Captain Leslie Garris, his face smudged with soot and his ears ringing, bellowed into the A4B phone circuit, "Don't abandon ship, we're going to save her." It was an order that sounded like a prayer, or perhaps a delusion. The most immediate threat, beyond the flames themselves, was the ship's own munitions. Bombs and rockets, heated by the surrounding fire, were exploding at random, tearing new holes in the vessel's ravaged body. This is where the damage control parties, the true firefighters of the Navy, earned their legend. Led by officers like Lieutenant Commander Joe Taylor, they became miners in a hellish cave. Dressed in flash gear, wielding hoses that seemed pathetically small against the wall of fire, they advanced into compartments where the temperatures could exceed 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Their water turned to steam before it even touched the flames. They fought not to extinguish the blazes, but to contain them, to create pockets of survival. One man, Lieutenant J.G. Donald Gary, an engineering officer, performed acts that bordered on the superhuman. He found a group of over 300 men trapped in a messing compartment deep inside the ship, the standard hatches warped shut by the heat and smoke pouring in. They were suffocating, their oxygen bottles long empty. Gary, memorizing the labyrinthine route through intake and ventilation ducts, made 3 separate trips into the poisonous darkness, each time leading a line of desperate sailors to the relative safety of the open forecastle. He didn't know if the next compartment would be a furnace or an arsenal about to blow. He just went. Meanwhile, the Japanese pilots circling overhead radioed their reports back to base. They had seen the massive hits, the column of smoke that rose to 20,000 feet, a pillar marking a funeral pyre. They reported the carrier as sunk, another confirmed kill for the Divine Wind. Their disbelief was still hours away. For the men on the Franklin, belief was a luxury. Every second was a battle against a simple physical truth. Steel loses its strength in intense heat. The great ship, her back broken by the blasts, listed heavily to starboard. She was dead in the water, a dying leviathan being consumed by its own internal fire. The order to abandon ship was given for some of the crew, and hundreds plunged into the oil-slicked water. But a skeleton crew, the stubborn and the damned, remained. They were fighting for a ghost ship, and the world was waiting to see if their faith was madness or miracle. From the bridge of the heavy cruiser, USS Pittsburgh, the site of the Franklin was a vision of naval annihilation. She was a pillar of fire by day, a torch against the horizon that illuminated the utter darkness of her own plight. Captain John Gingrich, commanding the Pittsburgh, had been ordered to stand by the stricken carrier and prepare to take off her crew. He, like every other commander in the task force, believed he was witnessing the death throes of a 27,000-ton warship. The cruiser's whaleboats and life rafts were lowered, slicing through the water thick with fuel oil, plucking exhausted, burned, and oil-slicked sailors from the sea. They expected to perform a rescue, not a salvage operation. But then, a strange and stubborn signal light began blinking from the Franklin's charred and listing bridge. It was Captain Garris. The message was short, insane, and magnificent. "We are going to try to save the ship. Stand by to take us in tow." Aboard the Pittsburgh, there was stunned silence. The carrier was still being racked by internal explosions. Her entire midsection was an open forge. How could any man still be alive aboard her, let alone fighting to save her? Yet they were. Below decks, a handful of engineers, led by Lieutenant Commander John L. Weeks, had become denizens of a mechanical underworld. Working in steam-filled, scorching hot compartments, often in near-total darkness, they fought to restore power. The bomb blasts had severed steam lines and knocked out the boilers. The ship was dead. Without power, there were no pumps to fight the fires, no pressure for the water mains, no lights for the men fighting below. It was a race against the rising seawater from firefighting efforts and the relentless advance of the flames. Through sheer brutal tenacity, they managed to light off one auxiliary boiler. It was a pitiful fraction of the ship's power, but it was a heartbeat, a single, struggling pulse in a body given up for dead. At 10 a.m., as if rising from its own funeral pyre, the Franklin began to move. The auxiliary steam had provided just enough power for the rudder to be manned. She was not under her own propulsion, but she was no longer a lifeless hulk. The Pittsburgh moved in, careful of the still exploding carrier, and passed a tow cable. The cruiser, a fraction of the carrier's size, began to pull the colossal wreck. The sight was surreal, a mortally wounded giant being led by a smaller, intact companion. It was at this moment that a Japanese reconnaissance plane, likely the same one that had reported her sunk, flew over the scene. The pilot would have radioed back a baffling, almost supernatural report. The carrier they had killed was not on the bottom of the ocean. It was moving. It was still afloat. It was, against all laws of naval warfare and physics, refusing to die. The legend of the American Iceberg carriers, the ships that could not be sunk, was born in that moment of stunned disbelief. While the Franklin began her impossible journey home, she was not alone in her defiance. She was part of a phantom fleet of carriers that haunted the Japanese high command. Among them was her sister, the USS Intrepid, a ship that had already earned the grimly affectionate nickname, the Evil Eye, from the Japanese for her relentless strikes against them. And like the Franklin, the Intrepid seemed to possess 9 lives. November 25, 1944, the Philippine Sea, off Luzon. The kamikaze came out of the sun, a tactic as old as warfare itself. For the crew of the Intrepid, this was not their first dance with the divine wind. Just a month prior, a suicide plane had smashed into her island, killing 6 men. They had repaired and returned. Now, as the general quarters alarm clanged through the ship, the crew ran to their battle stations with a practiced, grim efficiency. On the bridge, Captain Joseph L. Jack Sprague watched the approaching speck. This one was different. It was a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, faster and more deadly than the older Zeros. The anti-aircraft guns opened up, filling the sky with a storm of flak. The Judy weaved, jinked, but held its course. It plunged through the curtain of steel, its engine screaming in its final dive. At the last possible second, the pilot dipped his wing, aiming not for the open flight deck, but for the ship's nerve center, the island's superstructure. The impact was a deafening, shredding roar. The plane and its bomb tore into the port side of the island, directly beside the primary flight control booth. The explosion vaporized the booth and everyone in it, including the air officer, Commander John R. Doc Ballantyne. Fire and shrapnel swept the bridge, killing and wounding dozens. Captain Sprague was thrown to the deck, stunned but alive. The scene was one of utter carnage. The island was a shredded, burning skeleton. Fires raged on the flight deck among the parked aircraft. But the Intrepid's crew, hardened by previous attacks, did not pause. Damage control parties, led by men like Lieutenant F.M. Mike Michael, charged into the inferno. They fought the fires with a cold fury, knowing that the ship's aviation fuel lines and bomb elevators were just beneath their feet. Below decks, the engineers, much like those on the Franklin, battled to keep steam up. The hit had been devastating, but it had not penetrated the ship's vitals. Her engineering spaces remained intact, her turbines still turning. Within hours, the fires were under control. The Intrepid, her island a blackened scar, was still making 20 knots. She recovered her own aircraft. She had not just survived, she had continued to fight. As she steamed for the Ulithi anchorage for temporary repairs, her crew looked at the devastation around them with a kind of grim pride. The Japanese pilot had given his life to kill their ship, and he had failed. The Intrepid, like the Franklin, was more than steel and wire. She was a collective will, a spirit that refused to be extinguished. Back in Japan, after receiving the baffling report that the Evil Eye had survived yet another killing blow, a staff officer was said to have slammed his fist on a table and shouted in frustration, "Why won't these American carriers sink?" Aboard the USS Franklin, the battle had shifted from surviving the initial inferno to enduring a prolonged, grinding siege against the sea itself. The tow line from the Pittsburgh strained, a thick steel umbilical cord connecting the living to the presumed dead. For the skeleton crew of 704 officers and men who had refused to abandon their ship, every hour was a fresh trial. They were sailors navigating a ghost town of twisted metal, their world defined by the acrid, permanent stench of wet ash, charred wiring, and death. The list to starboard was a constant, ominous reminder of their fragility. Thousands of tons of seawater used to fight the fires had collected in the starboard side, creating a dangerous imbalance. If it worsened, the ship would simply capsize. The remaining damage control parties, led by officers like Lieutenant Commander James L. Schofield, became experts in a brutal form of triage. They navigated flooded compartments in near darkness, their boots sliding on oily sludge, feeling for the contours of valves and hatches with their hands. Their goal was counter-flooding, intentionally letting water into portside tanks to balance the ship. It was a desperate gamble, adding more weight to a vessel already swallowing the ocean, but it was their only play. Every time the list decreased by a single degree, a quiet cheer would ripple through the men. They were not just fighting the sea, they were fighting their own ship. Smoldering fires reignited when exposed to air. Weakened bulkheads groaned and gave way, and the bodies of their fallen shipmates, over 800 of them, remained where they had fallen in the most inaccessible and dangerous parts of the ship. There was no time for recovery, only the grim necessity of moving forward. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. Men collapsed at their stations, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollowed by exhaustion and trauma. Yet, slowly, miraculously, the Franklin began to respond. The auxiliary power held. The list stabilized. After a day under tow, the chief engineer sent a message to the bridge. The crew had managed to get 2 of the main boilers lit. Steam pressure was building. Captain Garris, his voice hoarse from smoke and command, gave the order that felt like a rebirth. All stop on the tow. Stand by to answer bells on our own power. The thick hawser from the Pittsburgh went slack and was cast off, and then, under her own power, the USS Franklin began to move forward. She was a mutilated wreck, her flight deck a grotesque sculpture of steel, her interior a tomb, but her heart was beating. She was sailing home. The 12,000-mile journey to the Brooklyn Navy Yard was a funeral procession, and a victory lap rolled into one. She stopped at Ulithi, then Pearl Harbor, causing stunned silence and awed salutes from every ship she passed. At Pearl Harbor, where the war had begun for America, workers swarmed over her, making temporary repairs for the final transit through the Panama Canal. To every sailor, every dock worker, and every intelligence officer who saw her, she was a message in steel. This is what American industry, American engineering, and most of all, American sailors could endure. The Japanese pilots who had sworn they sank her would soon see photographs of this very ship being repaired in an American dry dock, and they would be forced to confront a terrifying new reality.
They were not just fighting a navy, they were fighting a nation that refused to accept the possible. The return of the USS Franklin to the Brooklyn Navy Yard and the continued service of the USS Intrepid sent a seismic shock through the strategic calculus of the Pacific War. For the American public, these ships became instant symbols of tenacity. Their photographs, showing the Franklin's eviscerated flight deck and the Intrepid's scarred island, splashed across newspapers under headlines proclaiming, "The ship that wouldn't die." But for the Imperial Japanese Navy, particularly the young men of the kamikaze corps, it was a psychological blow that shattered a fundamental premise of their strategy. The Divine Wind was built on a brutal, simple arithmetic: 1 plane, 1 pilot, 1 ship. It was a transaction they believed no navy could long afford. But the American carriers broke this math. Japanese pilots, who had returned from missions certain of their success, would later be shown reconnaissance photos or hear radio intercepts confirming that their target was not only afloat, but was back in action. The disbelief curdled into a demoralizing superstition. They began to speak of the American flat tops as yokai, phantom apparitions, or as one captured pilot later confessed, as icebergs, where the damage you could see was only a fraction of the whole. A hidden, unsinkable mass lay beneath the waves. This was not entirely incorrect. It wasn't magic, but the culmination of relentless American industrial design and training. The resilience was engineered. Unlike the massive, single-hulled behemoths of the Japanese fleet, American carriers like the Essex class were designed with compartmentalization in mind. A maze of watertight compartments and bulkheads could localize flooding. Their damage control systems had massive redundancy, multiple electrical grids, steam lines, and fire mains. And most importantly, they were manned by crews who were not just sailors, but full-time firefighters. Every man, from a cook to an admiral's aide, was drilled relentlessly in damage control. They fought fires in training schools that replicated real infernos. They knew how to shore up a ruptured bulkhead, how to perform a cold patch on a steam line, and how to operate a pump they'd never seen before. The ship was a machine, but the crew was its unbreakable will. The Franklin was never repaired in time to see combat again. The war ended while she was still in dry dock. But her survival, and that of the Intrepid, which would earn her 3rd and 4th kamikaze kills in 1945, cemented a legacy. It proved that willpower, when backed by robust engineering and systematic training, could defy what seemed like certain destruction. The Intrepid would go on to serve as a recovery ship for the NASA space program, and now rests as a floating museum in New York City, her battle scars proudly preserved. The men of both ships, the saved and the saviors, carried the memory of those fateful days for the rest of their lives. They had stared into the heart of a man-made hell, not just from enemy action, but from the very ordnance and fuel they carried, and they had wrestled their ship back from the abyss. They weren't supernatural. They were simply, unforgettably, unbreakable.